The Humble Notebook is a powerful tool for learners of Chinese. Whether an exquisite leather-bound journal or a digital text file, the notebook offers more than a space to record information about vocabulary or grammar. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about taking notes and notebooks. I want to share my experience using a notebook for learning Chinese, and I used to be someone who almost never took notes in class because I thought that listening attentively was more important than trying to write things down, and thereby risking missing something important. While I still think that listening attentively sometimes can be more important than taking notes, I do take more notes these days, and I also recognize the importance of writing things down. Writing in general is a very powerful tool. It is a way to extend our memories to paper or to a digital file, and it will allow us to remember things and highlight things that we would otherwise risk missing or losing. Taking notes is not only good for learning Chinese, I also think it is key for leading a life without stress in general, because if you try to keep everything you need to keep track of in your head, that will in itself be very stressful and hard to do. So having a systematic way of writing things down is quite handy and useful in many ways. In this episode, I want to talk about notes and note-taking for learning Chinese or other languages. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about digital and analog notes. Most of the things I will talk about in this episode will be relevant no matter if you use your computer or phone to take notes or if you have an actual physical notebook. Naturally, both have their pros and cons, such as digital notes being easier to search, back up, and transfer, or pen and paper being simpler, more deliberate, and perceived as less intrusive in real-world conversations. I normally rely mostly on digital notes these days, but back when I studied full-time and had an actual classroom to go to, I used a physical notebook as well in combination. So I will talk about both in this episode, and like I said, most of the things that I will talk about will be relevant no matter how you write things down. This discussion about analog versus digital is similar to the one we had in episode 41 when I talked about tracking your language learning, and there we also looked at analog and digital tools, and we saw that analog tools have some specific use cases where they are great, but in general digital tools are easier to manage and so on. So let's now have a look at how keeping a notebook can increase learning opportunities and declutter the mind. You can think of these arguments as things I would have told a younger version of myself who didn't like taking notes at all. The first argument is that with a notebook, you won't forget to learn cool, interesting, or important words. When I encounter something in Chinese I think I ought to know, I write it down. My old philosophy here was that I didn't need to write it down because I would encounter it many more times simply by reading and listening more and engaging with the language. And that works well if you're studying full-time, especially in an immersion environment. You will probably encounter important words all the time. But nowadays, I'm not studying full-time and I'm already an advanced learner, so if I encounter something I really ought to know, it might take a long time before I encounter this again, and it's almost certain that I will not remember it, unless it sticks out in a very clear manner. Thus, by writing it down, I can make sure I do engage with it more if it is something I want to learn. And naturally, this does not mean that I write down every single word I don't know when I read and listen to Chinese. That would be very tedious and not very useful. I reserve this for things that are very important, cool, or interesting in some other way. I would also like to point out that while you will learn a lot of words through extensive reading and listening, that doesn't mean it hurts to write interesting things down. It helps your brain focus on these things and you get more exposure to them and so on. So while extensive reading and listening are great, that does not mean that you can't do anything else and that you should only read without thinking about what you're reading and without doing anything with it. Naturally, if you insert many other activities that might disrupt your listening and reading, it could be argued that you're no longer doing extensive listening and reading and therefore won't reap all the benefits. But check out episode 16 for more about this. The second argument for taking notes is more related to ideas and insights rather than, say, words or expressions. When I studied Chinese full-time, I had lots of insights about how the language worked. I suddenly figured out how a character worked or how characters work in general, something about tones, pronunciation, how people express themselves, how to learn something, and so on. And while you will remember some of these things, even if you don't write them down, it will be difficult to work with them actively. For example, if you write down the verbal feedback you get on your pronunciation when engaging with native speakers, you might notice that you have a specific problem with tones that will then gradually allow you to figure out that, okay, I've misunderstood how the third tone works. But if you don't write that down, that insight might come much later if nobody tells you about it. This is essentially what happened to me, which I talked about in episode 26 about learning the third tone in Mandarin. Again, note-taking here doesn't teach you anything new, but it helps your brain highlight things and it records them so you can study them later if you need to find patterns or really good ideas that you want to do something with. This brings us to the third benefit of taking notes, and that is you will never miss a good opportunity to ask a question. When learning a new language, and especially a language as foreign as Chinese, we typically have lots of questions. Some of these are very important and they can lead to insights into how the language works that will help you further down the road. But if you don't write anything down, most of these questions that you have will either go unanswered or you need to interrupt what you're doing to find an answer right now. Before I started taking notes properly, I also wasted many opportunities to ask questions. For example, I might encounter an advanced second language learner or a native speaker or a teacher, and they ask me if I have any questions. And usually my feeling is that I have a lot of questions, but if I don't write them down, it's very hard to know what to ask, and sometimes I don't come up with any question at all. So if you have a question, write it down, and the next time you encounter someone who might know the answer to the question, you can ask them. And this is something I also recommend students that I coach to do. Write down questions you want to discuss with me in next session. If you don't, it's likely that we will talk about things that I observe or that I think are important if you don't have anything to ask. And it's more important to base any discussion of learning Chinese on observations you have made and questions that you have rather than what I happen to think is important. The fourth and final argument for using a notebook or taking notes in some way is that it will help to declutter your mind. This is not strictly limited to language learning, and it has benefits for your life in general, but I do think that writing things down and having a trustworthy system to record things you need to do or things you need to remember allows you to think about what you're supposed to think about in the moment. So when you're listening to Chinese or when you're reading or having a conversation, you don't need to think about all those other things you were supposed to do or might want to do tomorrow because you have them written down. While this borders on the philosophical, I do think that being able to focus on what you're doing, on your learning when you are learning is important. And the more other things you need to keep in your mind, the more burdened your mind will be and there will be less space or capacity to focus on the Chinese. Now that we have discussed why taking notes can be useful, let's talk a little bit about how to take notes and what you should record. There is no one-size-fits-all solution here, and my goal is not to tell you how you ought to take notes, but rather to give you some ideas and show you how I do it. The first thing I want to talk about is being selective. Record things that stand out. Maybe they are, like I said earlier, very interesting, very cool, or something like that. Or it's something that violates something you've learned before and that you might want to look up. But don't record things just to record it. I don't like taking notes. Note-taking in itself might not be that useful. But if you write things down that you want your brain to pay attention to, you'll be better off. I will get back to this a little bit later, but resist the urge to record any word you don't know, especially if you're a beginner or intermediate learner. There will be too many words to learn, and it's not really a good idea to write all of them down. Next, it's important to provide context, or at least some explanation of your note. And this doesn't need to be a full paragraph, it can just be a few words explaining where you found this or the context in which a word appeared. And this is extremely important if you're going to ask questions later, because if you've asked any advanced learner or native speaker or teacher what a specific phrase or word means in Chinese, they will often ask you for the context. And without context, it's often hard to answer these types of questions. So write down where you found it and what kind of sentence this appeared in. So some context and some information about it. If you use a strategy I will discuss shortly, you will also put some time between taking the notes and actually doing something with them, and even if it's just a few days, it's sometimes surprising how little I remember of the notes that I took, so I just see a word and I don't know what it means, I don't know why I took this note and why it's significant. And well, maybe that is an argument for crossing it out and ignoring it, but that's not always the case. So let's make that a deliberate decision and write things down so we can actually judge whether it's important to learn or look up or whatever. Another thing I recommend doing is to use basic tags. And you can do this even if you have a paper notebook, and indeed in my paper notebook I used the most when learning Chinese. I used colors and symbols as tags. So before each note I simply wrote down a letter or a symbol that denoted what kind of note is this. So for example, in front of words I realized I really should learn, I used a plus sign. And if it was a question, I used a question mark. And if it was an idea for an article on hacking Chinese, I wrote HC. So this is very simple, it doesn't need to be complicated, but it helped me find the things that I wanted later. Naturally, if you're taking digital notes, having tags is much easier, and they are also searchable and so on, and maybe that's one of the main advantages of taking notes digitally. So assuming that you're doing at least some of these things, I do think that note-taking has an extra benefit that few people think about and use, and that is as an extra staging area for further learning. And what do I mean by that? I simply mean that normally when we decide to learn something, that is an immediate decision. For example, if you're reading on your phone and you're encountering a word that you don't know and you look it up, you then have the option to add this to the flashcard program of your choice, and you might decide to do so. There is no spacing here between encountering the word and deciding to study it later. This approach will lead to a lot of words to study in your flashcard program, and you might end up spending more time in that program than you do reading, and that is never a good idea. While it's easier to fall into this trap if you're reading digitally, it can happen if you read a printed book as well, and you just write down all the words you encounter in a list and you then try to learn them later. So what I think is a better idea here is to use your notebook as a staging area. You put things there that you think you might want to learn, but you don't decide to learn them in the moment. You do that later when you manage your notes. Maybe you do that at the end of the week or at least a few days later, and many of the words you encountered will not seem as important as they did when you read them, and then you can simply ignore them. While you can of course delete words from your flashcard program after you've added them, in my experience many students don't do this enough, and maybe there is a sunk cost fallacy here. You have invested enough energy into adding the word and maybe studying it a few times, and then when you realize that it's not that important, you think, but I've already seen it a few times, I've already worked on it, and maybe I should just keep going. And this is how you end up with too many flashcards for your own good. Better then to add a little bit of space between encountering the word and deciding to add it, and thereby having an extra opportunity to decide, is this really something you need to learn or want to learn? When I studied Chinese full-time, I went through my notebook about once a week, and among other things then, I did delete or cross out things that simply didn't seem as important as when I wrote them down, and this happens surprisingly often. Naturally, deleting something and deciding not to learn it saves an awful lot of time, and don't feel bad about doing this because learning a language is about priorities. There are many things you could learn, and so deciding that, no, I don't want to learn this thing yet, it will probably come up again later when it's important. That is perfectly fine and a healthy attitude to learning new things. You can't learn everything at once, so focus on the most important things first. The next thing I did after identifying the things I actually want to learn or deal with was to try to solve any problem that I could solve on my own. This could be as simple as looking something up in a dictionary, adding it to my flashcard app, or looking up a grammar pattern online or something like that. These are typically things I wouldn't put a question mark in front of, as in it's actually a question I want to ask someone else, because they can be readily solved using available software or online tools, websites, reference materials, and so on. If you want suggestions for online tools and websites you can use to solve these types of problems on your own, I'll put a link in the show notes. I do think it's important that you solve as many problems as you can on your own, not just because it helps you learn how these tools work and make you an independent learner, but also because your time with people who know more than you is limited and you need to use it for the things that truly matter. For example, it's a little bit unnecessary to ask your teacher what the basic meaning of a word is when you can equally well look that up in a dictionary on your own. However, there might be questions relating to the usage of this word that your teacher can answer but that the dictionary can't, or that you will find much harder to find an answer to on your own online. This kind of language question triage is something we talked about in episode 101. Now that you've answered the questions you could answer on your own, there will be a bunch of insights, questions, or notes that you can't really deal with on your own and where you need the help of a teacher or other qualified person. First, think about whom to ask. And normally when you're learning Chinese, you have certain people around you you know can help you occasionally. It might be your teacher, it might be a friend, it might be another language learner. But you do have certain people that you can ask, and if you don't, you can find them online or start a language exchange or do something else to get in touch with more people who are either learning Chinese themselves or are native speakers or have some other connection with the language. You can then tag or color the questions based on who you think is suitable for answering this question. If you're a beginner, this might seem a little bit strange. I mean, most people you encounter will know more than you do, so you can ask anybody anything. But the more you learn, the more you will realize that some people are very good at answering some questions, and other people are maybe not so good at answering some other types of questions. For example, people with a training in linguistics or who are professional teachers usually have much more awareness of how the language works and why they say things the way they do and so on. So if you have that type of question, you need to ask someone who actually knows the answer. This can be rather complicated, so if you have a question about how third tones work in a specific context, most native speakers will be able to tell you how they do it, but if you ask them to slow down or explain why it's like this and not like that, they will not be able to give you an answer. The same is true for grammar, and I'm sure you've experienced this if you've ever taught your native language to somebody else without being a teacher yourself, and the learner will ask you, why do you say this and not that? And you obviously know that it's A and not B here, because you're a native speaker, but when you try to explain why it's A and not B, it's not as easy as you might think. Well, if you think about it for a bit, maybe you will be able to come up with some kind of ad hoc explanation, but it's not necessarily the right one. For example, while I'm a native speaker of Swedish and can obviously speak the language, I cannot explain Swedish pronunciation. Well, I do have a background in phonetics, but I've never studied Swedish phonetics specifically, and when it comes to phonology, stress, and things like that, I'm even more lost. So if you have a question about that and you're learning Swedish, you shouldn't just ask me, you should ask someone who actually knows what they're talking about. So I think this ties into a misconception about native speakers, that they know everything about the language, and this is something that native speakers themselves think as well. And this is not just true in Chinese, it's true in Swedish or English as well. I wrote an article about this a while back called What Native Speakers Know and What They Don't, and I'll put a link in the show notes. But the important thing here is to realize that some people will be good at answering some questions and other people are good at answering other types of questions. And when you figure this out, simply tag the question so you know whom to ask what. Then next time you have a tutoring session with teacher Wang, you have a short list of questions to ask. And next time you have a coaching session with me, you already know what to ask and we can discuss what matters to you. Finally, I think it's important to have somewhere to store insights and ideas more long-term, and this goes a little bit beyond the scope of this article, but I do think it's important to have some kind of common place or an area where you can store knowledge in a way that you can then access later. A notebook is not very searchable, like I said, and even if you just use digital text files and you can search, it's still not very accessible unless you use something a little bit more fancy than a simple text file. I've used a service called Notion.so for many years now, and I use it for all sorts of things, including keeping track of Hacking Chinese articles, ideas for those articles, things I learn about languages that I study, things I need to do, things I need to remember, knowledge of different kinds, and ideas for what to do in the future, and so on. And like I said, this is slightly beyond the scope of this article, but maybe I can return to it later if there is interest. So to conclude this episode, these were some ideas of why you should take notes while learning Chinese and how that can help you, what you should write down, and how to manage your notes to make them easy to use and help you learn more Chinese. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.